Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at a match that I played a couple of days ago in the finals of the Bullet Chess Championship against none other than the former world chess champion but #1 ranked player in the world, Magnus Carlsen. Now, for those of you guys who are not following the event, I'll give you a quick recap. The event was 16 players. It was a double elimination format, meaning you had to lose 2 matches to be out of the event. I won all of my matches in the regular portion, the winner's bracket as we like to call it, and the grand finals I was paired against Magnus Carlsen, who had defeated Daniel Naroditsky, Alireza Firouzja, and many others. But there was one catch, which is that Magnus, if he wanted to claim the title for the Bullet Chess Champion in the year 2023, would have to beat me in 2 matches. Now, to give you some more background, the match, it was very straightforward. First match we played was 45 minutes and you had to win by 2. So if the clock ran out, the 45 minutes was out and nobody was ahead by 2, you would go to overtime. If Magnus won that match, there would be a second match with 30 minutes, exact same format. You must win by 2. So let's jump right into the action. So here we go. Now, the first game we're going to be taking a look at was the 5th game of the match. Now, the first 4 games went back and forth. We drew the first 2 games. I won game 3, Magnus won game 4. But game 5 was when I really started to feel very comfortable and I had a feeling that I would get great chances to win. So we started with e4. Magnus plays e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, bishop c5, d3, d6. All very standard, nothing very exciting, but there is one important point to note about this opening. Now, when I play this opening with the bishop out to c4 and b3 and bishop e3, I have very simple plans, and the onus is on black to prove what you're playing for. Now, the reason this is very tricky is twofold. First of all, black already is a big decision. For example, black can trade all the bishops off on b3 and e3 and simply castle. But in a bullet game where you only have 1 minute, no extra time being added, making these decisions in a split seconds is very, very difficult, and Magnus has a tough decision to make already. Does he want to trade the bishops off and castle and then give white easy play like knight h4, queen e1, queen g3, maybe queen g4, maybe knight f5, open play on the f file? Is this really what he wants to do? What does he need to do in this position? Now, of course, in a classical game of chess, you can take a lot of time here. You can also just play a move like bishop b6, and then white can potentially play a move like d4, but the onus is on white to find something. Now, it's worth noting that I actually have had this position quite a few times against Daniel Naroditsky from the white side in blitz, not bullet, so I am familiar with a lot of the themes. Nonetheless, after I play bishop e3, Magnus trades on e3. He plays queen d7, and I go knight h4. And this is what I referred to during my post-game interview during this Bullet Chess Championship as basically downhill running from football versus simply trying to juke and sidestep. Now, a lot of people are going to be mad at me because I'm using an American football reference, but essentially what I'm saying there is that in this position, white's moves are very easy. White tries to play on the f file. You want to go knight f5, queen f3, queen g3. The plan is very straightforward, and or d4, whereas black is the one who has to react to white's threats. Well, white's moves are all response to whatever black does. So for example, if black trades the bishop on b3 and let's just say castles kingside, you can sack the rook, go knight f5 and queen g4, queen h5, and just win the game on the spot immediately. Additionally, if black tries to play a move like d5 after takes, even a position like this with knight f5 should be pretty good for white. So white reacts to whatever black does, and black has to find these moves, and in bullet it's very, very difficult to be precise when your opponent is simply reacting to every single move that you play. So I thought this opening choice from Magnus was very dubious, and we'll see why. So he goes knight e7, I play queen f3, he plays c6, I go queen g3 here, trying to attack the pawn on g7. We get knight h5, I go back, and now I do the repetition, try to gain like that 0.1, 0.2 extra seconds. We get knight f6, and now I play d4. Now again, a very thematic move, trying to take space in the center of the board. Magnus castles, I play rook a d1, again, very logical, threatening to capture the pawn and win the queen on d7. One example would be a6, takes, and spaghetti-o, you lose the queen on d7. So all of my moves here are very, very routine, very straightforward. So Magnus goes queen c7, and again I go for the tickle here, try to pick up that extra 0.2, 0.3 seconds because in bullet it does matter. Again, we do the double repetition, and now I decide to trade the bishop on e6 and play this move queen to h3. Now queen h3, very simple move here because I'm sidestepping any threats on this f file, and I attack the weak pawn on e6. Magnus goes queen c8, I trade, and now I go knight to f3 back, and now Magnus is already in a lot of trouble because here black has a problem with these double pawns on e5 and e6. My pawn on e4 is guarded by the knight on c3, but how does black guard these 2 pawns? If you go queen c7, if you go queen c7, I take the pawn on e6, and if you don't do that, let's say you go king h7, I take the pawn on e5. So the only way to not lose one of these 2 pawns on the spot here is to play knight g6. But now after queen g3, black is going to lose material because the knight is under attack, but the pawn on e5 is also weak. So Magnus goes king h7, I take, We trade the knights on e5, and already here Magnus is struggling. He's down 5 seconds on the clock here, down a pawn, and it's a difficult position to play. And once again, white's moves here are also not difficult, because what I intend to do, say black plays a move like rook b8, is maybe a move like rook d6 to go after the pawn on e6, or even a move like knight to e2 with the idea of knight d4, knight f4 ganging up on this weak pawn on e6 here. So it's very, very difficult for black to play. I have a 6-second time advantage, and it's starting to go in the wrong direction. So Magnus plays knight g4. I play queen g3. He trades the rooks, goes e5 here. Not knight f6, because after knight f6, white can play e5, knight d5, and then rook f7 with the classic kebab on the 7th rank, and it should be winning very soon. So he goes e5. Now I play h3, kicking the knight away from g4. The queen guards the pawn on e3. Goes back to f6. Now I gobble second pawn for free. Now mind you, I do have double pawns in e4 and e3, but the 2 extra pawns are really, really useful here. So we get queen e8. I play queen f5 very quickly. Magnus goes queen g6, and here I play e5. Now it's very important to note, one of the reasons I know that I was feeling the rhythm is Magnus is always a player who creates complications. Even when he's in trouble, he creates complications. He makes it difficult for his opponent. But here I'm playing all these moves very quickly. I'm feeling the rhythm, and I simply don't let up. Magnus trades the queens, goes king g6. Now I play g4. Again, when you look at these moves, I'm moving very quickly, very logical moves. Pawn guards the rook. Knight has to move. Knight d7. I go e6, knight b6, and now I play knight to e2 very quickly with the idea of knight d4 or knight f4. Magnus plays knight to d5, but now I go e4, attacking the knight. Knight has to move to c7, and now I go knight f4 check. King has to go to h7. Now I go rook f7 very quickly, hitting the knight, creating the kebab on the 7th. And after knight to b5, knight to h5 here, Magnus resigns the game because he's simply losing his pawn on g7. If you play a move like rook g8 to guard the pawn, I have knight to f6, forking the king and the rook. You cannot take the knight due to the fact that I would capture your king. And after king h8 takes rook f1, I just go e7, rook f8, and I will simply be winning very soon. So back to the position after knight h5 here. Magnus resigns the game. I get this big win in game 5, and I take a 3-2 lead. Now it's really important to note that essentially what happened here is I played a tempo. I played all my moves very much in the flow. Didn't really ever have to think for a long period of time. And it's worth noting also that one of the reasons that I felt that I got off to a really bad start against Alireza Firouzja in the finals of the winners bracket is that I started playing a lot of e4 e5 systems, and my general feel in bullet chess is that when you play e4 e5, it's much easier for white to play for the most part than it is for black to play. So keeping that in mind, after winning this 5th game against Magnus, taking a 3-2 lead, I decided, you know what, I don't want to play e4 e5. I'd rather go the other direction, play my modern setups and see if they work. If they don't work, I can default to e5, maybe play Carlsen's other setups. But I win this 5th game of the match, and I'm ahead 3-2, and now in the 6th game I play d6, and I decide, as I was starting to say, that I'm going to play the moderns. If I get blown away out of the opening of the moderns, then I can default to 1e5, maybe play Sicilian, maybe play Carlsen, French, whatnot. You know, there are many options, but I decided I'd go with the modern and see if it works. Now, if it works, of course, I'm going to use it for the whole match. If it doesn't, then I'll adjust in match and change the strategy. So I play the modern here, and this was the first sign to me that Magnus was not completely on, because Magnus plays this bishop c4 queen e2 line, which is very problematic. In classical chess, I lost a game in the United States Chess Championship to Zviad Izori, I think after castles e5. If I remember correctly, I think I played knight e8 in that game, but I could be wrong. At any rate, if white plays bishop c4 and queen e2, the whole point is to play for e5 here. So white wants to play for e5 here. In general, when white plays a setup with bishop c4 and queen to e2. So basically this is what white is trying to do when you play queen e2. So when I play c6 here, Magnus goes bishop b3. Now again, in this position, nothing wrong with bishop b3 here, but white always wants to play for e5, and Magnus is not able to get it. So I go a5, he goes a4, I castle, and he plays h3. Now again, e5 is a very obvious move here that should be played at some point, because after h3, I get to play e5 myself. And once again, we're in the situation we're talking about downhill running versus juking and deking and going side to side behind the line of scrimmage from American football. And the reason I use this reference is because I can't think of another sport where it applies as in such a straightforward manner. But the point is, when I refer to downhill running, you're going straight forward. It's like you run into the defender, you're running into him, you're going to plow him over. There's nothing special, nothing fancy about it, but you know what you're aiming for. Whereas when you're trying to go side to side and all these other things, there's a lot of room for various interpretations, various things that can happen. But here when I play e5 and I get this position, my play is so straightforward. We trade, castles, queen e7 is played, and I have a simple plan. I want to put a knight on c5, maybe trade off these light square bishops, maybe play on the open file, but it really comes down to getting a knight to c5 and or trading light square bishops, and that's all I care about. Literally, I have very straightforward, narrow set focus on plans that I'm aiming for. So Magnus goes knight to a3, I play bishop e6, he trades, and now he plays this move rook e1, I go knight b d7. Now I've traded off that great light square bishop that white had on this long diagonal, and I'm going for knight c5. Magnus plays queen c4, I go rook f8, and now he blunders with this move bishop to e3, which hangs a pawn after queen takes queen, knight takes queen, and knight takes e4 here. And now I'm simply up a pawn in the center of the board. So I'm up a pawn in the center of the board. We're in an endgame. It's easier for me to play. Everything I do here will be a reaction to white does. And another example of that is, say white goes bishop c1. I can simply play f5. I can also go knight c5. Most likely I would probably just play f5 to guard the knight, but I'm reacting to what white does. So Magnus plays rook d1, I go knight dc5, and as you'll notice, I'm already up a couple of seconds on the clock, and it's already very difficult to play. So Magnus goes knight b6, I play rook a6 here. Now this might not be the best move, but again, I'm trying to play quickly, not get down on the clock, and it makes a lot of sense because I attack the knight on b6, and now the pawn on a4 is potentially hanging after white moves the knight away. So Magnus goes knight d7, I take the pawn on a4, we got bishop c1, and now I go knight dc5. Again, another excellent move here by me, played instantly. All these reactionary moves that I have are very simple and easy to play. I don't have to use a lot of time, and it really puts a lot of pressure on Magnus because he's trying to move just as fast as I am to keep up, but he's gotten into a position which objectively is lost, where he's simply down 2 pawns here. So Magnus takes on e5, I take, he takes, I take, and now he goes rook d8 check, king g7, and he plays this move f3, trying to recover the knight which he just sacrificed, because if I move my knight away, I lose the rook on e5, and with it I lose the game. So after f3 here, I play another excellent move, rook d5 here, which is really useful, because what I do is I sidestep any threats on the e file, and now white has to trade the rooks. If you move the rook to say b8, I simply go knight f6, and with 2 horses versus a bishop, 2 horses will always win. So Magnus trades the rooks, takes back, or he doesn't take back the knight, sorry, he goes bishop e3 here. Now he could have obviously taken the knight. The reason he didn't do this is after d takes e4, quite simply, I have 2 extra pawns anyway. Actually, I think the game is going to transpose, because after bishop e3, I play rook c6 anyway. He checks, I go f6, he takes a knight, and now I take back with the pawn. Now the dust has settled. I simply am up 2 pawns in the center. I have a knight, which in bullet chess is much better than a bishop. Basically, the reason for that is quite simple. Knight can jump all over the board, much easier squares to put it on. Bishops generally are only on 1 diagonal, so it's very hard to use them effectively. And if you get in a scramble, having a bishop is much worse, because knights start jumping all over the place, and you simply can't pre-move and anticipate the squares they will go to. So after d takes e4, we got bishop takes c5, I take rook e4, and now I play king f7 here. Maybe not the best move, but the point is that if I were to take the pawn on c2, after rook to e7 check, king h6, rook takes b7, I am up a pawn in this endgame, but it should be a draw. Now mind you, at this point Magnus is way down on clocks. There's no guarantee for this. Actually, I realized he's not way down. He would have been down I think about 5 seconds had I done that. I think if I was up 5 seconds, even though the clocks don't illustrate the point correctly here, if I was up 5 seconds, I don't think I would win this endgame. I would say it's probably close to 50-50. So I don't want to do that. I go king f7, trying to massage the position, keep the game going. White doesn't have any obvious ways to play. So Magnus goes b4, we trade, I go b5, and it's really useful here that after rook b2, I can bring the king closer, and Magnus does not have a way to trade off the c2 pawn for this b5 pawn. If he could magically trade the pawn in any of these endgames, this would be a draw. So Magnus goes rook to a2, I play king to d5, king f2, king c4, just trying to bring the king as close as I can and escort the b pawn up the board. We get rook a3, I play king b4, rook b3, king a4, rook to b2, guarding the pawn on c2. Now I go b4, check, king b5, he goes king e3, I play check, king d4, and now I play this very nice move, rook to g3. Now rook to a3 might also be playable, but after rook to a3, white potentially has ideas like c4. So I go rook g3, Magnus plays rook b2, and now I play a very important move, which is f5. If I were to play rook takes g2, I lose the game on the spot. This great move, pawn c4 check. I can't play end peasant because my king is in check. Actually, even if I could take, I'd still lose the rook, but after I move the king, white takes the rook and wins the game. So here I play f5, Magnus plays c4 anyway, but now after king to a4, with the king and the pawn marching up the board, it's completely hopeless. Magnus plays c5, I go king to a3, rook e2, b3, c6, I go b2 here, and he plays c7. Now if Magnus were to play rook to e1 for example here, I can play rook takes g2. If c7, I have rook to c2, and if white goes king to d3 here, I can simply play king to b3, and after c7 I have rook to c2, again winning the pawn on c7. So Magnus decides to play c7, but after queen d3 check, the rook guards the queen, king e5, queen takes e2, and it's GG, why not? The game concludes after king f6 check, king f7, queen b3, king g7, and now I play this move rook c3, queen a8, king b2, and Magnus resigns here. He's simply down a rook here. He's also down about 6 seconds on the clock, and it's just totally hopeless. So Magnus resigns in the 6th game, and now after the 6th game, I'm now leading by a score of 4-2. Now the next game we're going to take a look at is much later on. Now I won a couple of games. This was the 2nd game in a row I won. I think I won 2 more games in a row. I really expanded a nice lead, and we're going to take a look at one of the critical moments here, which is game number 14. Now at this point I had built the lead up to 9-4. So here I'm leading by a score of 9-4. I'm up by 5 points, and this is the first moment in the match, without providing spoilers, where I feel like if I had won this game, I think I would have won this match. No drama, very little hype, and it all would have been very smooth. So this is game number 14. I'm up 9-4, and again Magnus plays e4, and I play my classic modern setup here with d6. Magnus plays knight f3, a6, h3, and now I go knight to f6, bishop e3, I castle, bishop d3, knight c6, castles, and I get e5. And again, I would say that objectively, the big weakness that Magnus had throughout this match is that when I played these modern setups, his reactions were not great. I was able to get the flow where I could blitz out 10, 15, 20 moves, and he simply didn't have any answer for that. So he trades and he goes bishop c4. Now this is one of the big mistakes in the match that I think Magnus made, which his strategy throughout the match, and I think in general, even in Bullet, has been to get into endgames. Now, there's nothing wrong with getting into endgames. Magnus is obviously one of the greatest, if not greatest, endgame players in the world. But my general feel for it was that Magnus was not getting endgames where there was any pull. And what I mean by that is the endgames Magnus was getting into, like this one here, you have a symmetrical pawn structure. So there's really very little imbalance at all. And so because there's no imbalance in the pawn structure, the moves for me are very easy to play, and I can continue to blitz out the moves. And I felt that in most of these endgames that we reached throughout the match, I was simply able to blitz out these moves, and Magnus was just a little bit slower, and by the time he tried to prove any kind of advantage, he was down 5 to 6 seconds, and it was already too late to convert those advantages. So I think one of the biggest mistakes in this match that Magnus made was his willingness to go into endgames. Now, of course, can't fault him. He's great at endgames, and it was working against players like Ali Reza. I think in the second to last game, as well as the final game of their match, Magnus played some masterpiece endgames, which he won. So he tried to follow this, but throughout the match, he didn't get away from it until it felt like it was a little bit too late, which allowed me to build a big lead. Now, this game is very critical because, as you'll notice, my moves are very easy. When he goes rook d1, I don't want to trade the rooks here because after trades, white can infiltrate with rook d8. I don't want to go bishop e6 because after takes, I have these double pawns on e6 and e5. So rook e8, instant move that I can play right away. Magnus plays f3, bishop e6, instant move to trade off the light square bishop because the bishop is really nice on this long diagonal. Very similar to the first game that we looked at with the bishop on b3, where I traded off the light square bishops. So we trade, we get king f2, I go bishop f8, knight a4, b5, goes knight c5, which is already a little bit dubious, not that bad per se. Probably here I should have played rook c6 if I had time to think, just to stop knight c5, and then if white goes c3, now b5 will trap the knight on the edge of the board. At any rate, I play b5, knight c5, I go rook c6, Magnus plays b4, and now I go a5, trying to undermine the pawn as well as the knight on c5. He goes a3, we trade, I take, he takes with the pawn, and now I go king to g7. Now again, all these moves, very easy to play. I don't have to use a lot of time to think, but it's worth noting here that in this position after rook a5, Magnus has achieved a position where he is a little bit better. He's gotten the advantage, but at what price? The first issue is that Magnus is down 3 seconds on the clock. The second issue is that, again, we're getting into a knight versus bishop situation. Now, in a classical game, it wouldn't matter at all. Maybe even blitz, it wouldn't matter at all. But in a bullet game, the bishop is much harder to maneuver than the knight, as we will see. So I go b4, rook b5, knight d7. He plays king e2. I go here. He takes the pawn on b4, knight f8. So I've now rotated the knight to e6, where it will potentially jump to f4 or d4, but it also will guard the pawn on c7. So after king d3 and knight e6 here, the big problem for white is how do you prove the advantage? And already the computer actually doesn't see a big advantage, which says a lot in and of itself. But the problem is here, how do you prove it? You're the one who's going to have to come up with moves with the white pieces. Bishop is not very active. It's quite passive, in fact, simply guarding the pawn on c5. Knight guards the pawn on c7. I can bring my king over. I can bring the rook behind with rook a1, rook h1, g1, or rook d1. So all my moves here are very easy to play, and Magnus is the one who has to prove the advantage. And with a knight versus bishop in a bullet game, I think it's extremely hard to play. So Magnus goes king c4. I play rook a2, king d5 here, which is a mistake, but Magnus again already down a little bit of time on the clock, and he goes all in with king d5. You could of course go king b3, but then I would simply start chilling with rook a1, king c4, and rook a2. And as the old saying goes, I'm bing chilling with this rook on the a file, and Magnus has to prove some kind of advantage. So he goes king d5, going all in. I take, he takes on e5, I take on g2, and now material is even, but once again it's very hard to play. The knight guards the pawn on c7. You can't easily get the bishop on these dark square diagonals to attack the king, and so from a practical standpoint, black has great chance to win. So Magnus plays f4. I go rook g3, attacking the bishop, attacking the pawn. Bishop f2, I play rook f3, and now he goes f5 here. Now it's a very important point that I don't take on h3, because after f5, after knight d8, I'm better here, but it feels really scary with moves like f6 where the king has to run to the edge, or even moves like king d5 followed by rook b8 or bishop d4. And now the reaction starts to switch the other way, where Magnus has obvious moves and I have to react. I have to come up with a plan to anticipate rook b8, to anticipate bishop d4, and it's very, very hard to play. So I play rook f3, goes f5, I take, I take, he takes. Now I play rook e2, very nice move to win the pawn on e6. King d5, I take, he goes c6, and now I play check, king c5, rook to e6, and he goes rook d4. I play rook e7, rook d7, king f6, and now Magnus makes a howler by playing this move, king d5. Now this move loses on the spot, but at this point Magnus was down 5 seconds, just moving very fast before playing this move. Now here I play h5, h4, I check here, I go back, and again he plays king d5, and I miss it. What I should have played here is I should have traded the rooks, gone king to e7, because after king c6, king d8, I simply have 2 extra pawns. White will have to play king d5, and after takes is just very simple here. Many ways to win, but probably simplest is something like this. And eventually I will distract the king with the c pawn and run the king all the way up, and this is just very simple. I just play h4, h3, h2, h1, promote to a queen, and I win the game with no issues. Now what makes this worse that after check, rook e7, king d5, this was actually a threefold here with king d5 being played, and I realized as soon as the game ended that I could have traded the rooks. Now if I hadn't realized this, I don't know if it would have affected the mindset, but I did realize, as you guys probably will have noticed in the actual VOD we uploaded from when I was streaming this live, but I realized as soon as the game was over. Now I will say this, if I had used my time somewhere around this point right here, and I had traded the rooks and played king e7, king 6, king d8, I think I would have won this match very, very convincingly, and probably would not have gotten close whatsoever. Nonetheless, this game ends in a draw. So after this draw, it's now the score is 9.5 to 4.5 after 14 games. I'm still leading by 5 games, feeling very, very good. Now after this game, there was a big slew of draws before Magnus started chipping at the lead a little bit. He won a game here or there. I think it was, he won the next game, then we drew something like 4 or 5 in a row, then he won another game. So next game we're going to look at is the 24th game of the match. Now at this point, I am still leading by a score of 13 to 10. This is the second point in the match where I think that if I had kept my wits about me, probably I win this match with no drama. So this game, I keep playing this modern setup. Magnus still failing to adjust to what I was doing. I get this e5. We get another endgame here. As I said before, Magnus, it seemed to me, was way too happy to go into endgames. Endgames where there's some imbalance, I understand, but endgames which are very symmetrical like this, where the pawn structure, nothing is happening, I think this was a huge mistake, because just in general, I felt that my moves were easier to play, and I was just a little bit faster than Magnus was in general. So this game goes on, not a whole lot happens. I make a slight mistake here. Probably what I should have done here is I should have played knight d7, so on knight f3 I can go f6, connect the pawns and stop knight g5, because when I play h5 and knight d7 here, white is able to trade the knight for the bishop, and white gets the 2 bishops versus the bishop and the knight. That being said, we're in the same situation where long term I'm looking to get a bishop versus a knight, and if I can get that, I think once again I will simply be able to win in a bullet game. So Magnus goes bishop c4, I play rook e7, rook d1, I play f6 here, connecting the pawns. He goes a4, play a5, logical move to stop him from pushing. We get rook d3, rook h8, f3. I play bishop h6. Important, by the way, that Magnus doesn't go rook d1, because here I do have bishop h6 trading off the dark square bishops. No squares are available for the bishop anywhere else. He could go bishop a7, but then I can even maybe go rook a8 or something like this. And where's the bishop going? So here he plays f3. I go bishop h6, bishop f2 to keep the two bishops alive here. I play bishop f8, rook d1. I play rook h7, simply guarding the knight on d7 twice. We get bishop e1. I play b6, bishop f2, and now I go rook e8 with a very simple plan of playing bishop c5 to try and trade off the dark square b's. So we get king f1, and now I play knight c5. Now, of course, I could have played bishop c5 here, but I spotted that on knight c5 I'm hitting the rook and the pawn. This is a classic fork, and Magnus either has to trade the bishop or play rook to a3. So Magnus goes rook to a3, trying to keep the bishop pair on the board. I go knight to e6, rook a1, and now I play h4 here, trying to grip the f4 square with my horse. Magnus plays c3. I go bishop c5. Again, knight f4 is also completely fine, but I play bishop c5, goes bishop e1. I play knight f4. He goes b4, and now I trade and go bishop d4. Now, time is still fairly balanced, but again, the problem here for Magnus is that even though the computer gives white a small edge, it's very hard to prove an advantage here after rook c1 and king b7, because all my moves are anticipation. When he goes rook c1, I have to slide step the king, so there are no threats on the c file. And once he goes a5 and I go b5, how does white prove an advantage? So we get bishop b3. I go rook c7, rook c2. I go g5 here. Now, of course, I should have played g5 right away. When I did this move, it does hang the pawn on h4, but at this point we're moving so fast, so I go g5, rook c1, rook c8, overprotecting the pawn on c6 here. Magnus plays bishop d2. I play c5 here. We trade. Everything starts to eventually come off the board after rook b8, king e2, b4, bishop c4, king a7, bishop b3, and rook b5. Magnus plays a6 here. He could have played c6, but after rook a5, now the rook is activating on the a file. If white plays king d3, there's even a move like bishop c3 to go after this pawn on c6. So we inevitably get to this end game here after a6, where we have opposite color bishops here on b3 and c5, but Magnus goes for this king e6 move. Now, I have to point out that here Magnus could have made the draw. He could have just played king c4, bishop e1, and just waited forever. There's really no way for black to make any progress. The king stops any infiltration here, but Magnus decided to play king e6. Now, this is a very double-edged move, because when he goes king e6, king c5, now my king is running in. But Magnus, whether it's just playing so many end games or whatnot, somehow he knew this was not actually dangerous. So he takes, I go king d4, and at this moment, when I played king d4, the split second before Magnus' next move, I have to say that when I saw him take the pawn at f6, I thought I was going to win this game. I thought my king is coming in, I'm pushing the pawn, he'll have to sack the bishop for the pawn, and I will win the game. But I was wrong, because after bishop d5, bishop g3, king f5, I just wait. Problem is I can never get king c3 without hanging the pawn on e5. So I go bishop c3, he goes king g5. Of course, here what I'm trying to do is run the king in again, where the bishop guards the pawn. King g5, I guard the pawn at h4, king f6. We get back to this position where I go bishop f2. We do a bunch of dilly-dallying here, nothing exciting. And finally here, I decide to go king f2, and I decide to gamble. Now, this move in and of itself is not terrible. It's still probably a draw with perfect play, but we're in a situation where I have 2.7 seconds. It's game number 26, I believe, or game number 24 of the match. So I'm up by 3 points in game 24. We're down to, I think, about 5 minutes here, maybe 5 or a little bit more than 5 minutes. It's really flipping a coin here, because if I'm right and I go for it with king f2 and it works, I will win the game. I will guaranteed win the match. But if I lose, it's back to a 2-point lead. It's back within the margins of where Magnus could come back. So it's very double-edged. I decided to play king f2, which I think was a huge mistake here. I used 1.9 seconds before playing it. Probably if I was going to do it, I should have just blitzed it out instantly. I used 1.9 seconds, and after king e5, king g2, king f4 takes e5. It's still probably a draw here, but I have to be extremely precise. I have to go bishop f2, e6, bishop c5, but after king e5, king g3, f4, it looks like white is too fast here with the f5, f6 idea, but apparently it's still a draw. I can go, actually, I think after h3, f5, the reason it's a draw is h2, f6. I have b3, e7, and here I can play b2, and white queens, black queens, and probably it's a draw of perfect play, but it's very, very messy because white also gets all the checks here. This probably is some kind of a draw with bishop g1 here, but it's very, very scary. Even moves like bishop c4 threatening mate on e2 or queen f1, very, very hard to play with no time on the clock. So I play bishop g3, king f5, and now I blunder with king h2, and after f4, now I'm losing the game. I play h3, e6, bishop h4, and now after king to g4, this isn't best. Magnus should have played, I think, king e5, maybe it's still a draw here. I thought this was winning. Computer says it isn't, but he goes king g4, bishop e7, f5. And while this is a draw, the problem is now I'm down too much time. I have 3.5, Magnus has 6 seconds. I just can't set it up the way that I want to. Now, there's one moment here where I have a chance right here where I could have taken the pawn at f5 and drawn, but as you can see from the time, I'm down to 1.9 seconds. I don't really have time to pre-moving king f5 is not a safe pre-move because if Magnus doesn't move the king, it won't be executed. So obviously I pre-move king f4, and after f6 I simply, maybe it wasn't a pre-move, but I play king f4, and after f6 I'm losing the game because now Magnus will get a queen. The game concludes here after a few more moves. After queen takes b4, I flag, I lose this game, and now the match is 13-11. Now this is the second game where I think that if I had kept my wits about me and made the threefold repetition and drawn the game, probably I would have won this match without any drama. So I lose this game, and now it gets to 13-11. So after it gets to 13-11, I lose the next game, which would make it 13-12. And then we're going to take a look at this game number 27, game number 26. So here I'm leading 13-12. Now this game is also very important because I'm leading 13-12. I think at this point we're down to about 3 minutes. So we're down to a situation where the final 2 or 3 games I'm leading by 1 point. So I know we're probably going to overtime. By overtime, what I mean is that if the match is tied after the 45 minutes are up, or someone's only up by 1 point, you play an additional 6 games, and after those 6 games, if someone's up by 1 point, they win the match. If it's tied, I think you just go to ultimate sudden death, where essentially whoever wins first will win the match. So again, I play my classic modern here. Magnus again fails to play e5, a sign sort of that he clearly wasn't completely feeling it. He lets me get e5. Now actually e5 here is a blunder because after e5 takes, I potentially hang my queen. So already here I'm feeling very bad about myself because I'm leading 13-12. I know that if I win this game, I probably build a 2-point lead. There will only be time for one more game potentially, and I will have great chances to win the match. It'll be a situation where there's no risk. If I lose, I'm up by 1 heading into the final 6, and of course if I don't lose, well, I just win the match. But I hang this pawn. Now one thing that is really critical and that I think I did extremely well in this match, even when I wasn't playing my best, is I kept moving on. Now there's a show that I watched not a long time ago, maybe a few months ago. I believe it's called The Imposters, and there's the sort of the tagline of the show, or the quote in the show that stuck with me, which is the main tagline, or main quote, is basically it's always move forward. There's like never go backwards, always move forward. And I really sort of applied that a lot throughout this match, where even when I got this position where I'm down upon out of the opening, I didn't sort of give up. Now a good example of giving up was there was a game, I think the second to last game between Magnus and Alireza, where Alireza did something very similar. He hung a pawn and then he started shaking his head. He was visibly disgusted and he just fell apart and lost the game. So I just keep moving forward. So I play bishop g4, Magnus plays h3, and now I play his knight d4, which is a nice little trick. Magnus takes, I take back, and now he takes on f3. Now what Magnus should have played here was he could have actually just played queen d3 and sacrificed the rook, because after takes bishop h5 g4, I'm going to lose the bishop. There are all sorts of dark square weaknesses around my king here, and it's going to be GG. But Magnus doesn't do that. Instead, he takes the bishop, I take the rook, and now I'm sort of back in business. Now, one problem with this position after bishop h6, bishop g7, bishop f4 is that white can put this knight on d5 here. He's got a great diagonal for the light square bishop, and so white's moves are easier than black's. This is a situation where I have to come up with a plan, but white's moves will be reactionary, whether it's rook d1, whether it's knight d5, or whatnot. His moves are easy, my moves are difficult. So I go bishop e5, we get rook d1, I play queen f6. Now this is a bad move, but again, I don't want to spend too much time, burn too much clock, and get into the danger zone. So I just play this move because after knight d5, queen g7 here, I figure, okay, so what? He got the knight to d5, the queen's on g7, maybe king h8, maybe f5, but I'm just going to try to play fast and try to keep the pressure up on the clock. So Magnus goes bishop e3, I play knight f6, he trades. Now this is of course completely fine, but even though I've given back a pawn, now my moves become much easier here because now I have one goal: get the rook to the open file. One of the rooks has to get to the open file. That's my only goal here. So it becomes very easy for me to play now. So we get rook d7, I play rook d8, Magnus takes the pawn. I cannot capture the bishop because then rook takes d8 will win the game. I go king g7, he trades the rooks, not rook takes b7, because rook to d1 is the classic ice skater. The king on g1 is stuck. So he trades the rooks, goes bishop d5. I take on b2. He takes on b7. And now I check king h2 and I play bishop d4. Now this is a very thematic move here, bishop d4, because what I'm trying to do here is that if white can keep the two bishops on the board, it's going to be very easy to play. Whether it's f4 e5, whether it's c4 c5, white will be able to push some pawns up the board very quickly. But once I'm able to trade off a set of bishops, we end up in a situation where it's rook versus bishop. And when you only have one bishop on the board, it's very hard to play because you have to be very careful. Bishops don't have many targets, especially in this position with only these pawns on the king side. So for that reason, it's a very good idea if you're in a situation where your opponent say two bishops only on the board, or say bishop and knight. If you can trade off the knight and get a situation where your opponent only has one bishop, generally it's going to give you great chances. So Magnus takes, I take on e4, not rook a4, by the way, because after bishop d3, rook a2, f4, now white has the four connected pawns to push in the center of the board. So of course here I take on e4 to leave him with the two split pawns. Magnus plays bishop b5. I go king f6. We get a4, rook b4, king g3, rook b2, c4. Now the bishop guards both of the pawns here, and you can also go c5, c6, or a5, a6. Play king e5. We get c5, rook c2, c6, and now I play this move g5. Magnus plays king f3. I go h6, g3, and king d6. Now here it's still very tricky to play for me, because again, if white can create the wide peepo with say f4, for example, or something like this, just to illustrate the point, if white can get the three pawns that are completely split here, it's a very easy win. So after king d6, Magnus plays h4. I trade. I go rook c5, king g4, play h5, king f4, and now I go rook d5. Now this is very, very dangerous for me, because if the king can ever get to g5 or f5, white just wins the game instantly. But I defend this extremely well. After king e4, I check. I keep waiting on this fifth rank so the king can never enter here. And after f3, rook e5, he goes bishop d3, play rook a5, goes bishop e4. Now this is actually a mistake here. Magnus should have played bishop to b5 here. In fact, I'm kind of shocked that I actually played rook a5 and allowed bishop b5 as opposed to say going rook c5. Alas, it is what it is. So I go here, Magnus plays bishop e4, and now correctly I play rook c5. I do not take the pawn, because now if the king gets in here after king g5, rook a5, king g6, white will start pushing the f pawn, and there's a very good chance that I will lose this game. So after bishop e4, I go rook c5. Magnus plays king e3. I go rook a5, king f4, rook c5, king e3, rook a5, king f4, and the game ends in a draw. And with that, I maintain my very, very slim lead by a margin of 13.5 to 12.5. Now, the next game, the next game that we're going to be taking a look at is this game, which this game I think was with me leading by 1 point here. I think this was 13.5, 12.5. I believe game 27. I could have the numbers wrong. But at any rate, this game is not so much a game that shows great play, but it shows one of the big differences in my mindset and my approach to chess these days. So we start with e4, d5. I play knight c3, takes, knight f6, knight g3. Pretty standard stuff here. Magnus starts pushing the pawn, trying to attack on the king side, takes space in the center. We get h3, g3, knight c6, knight e3, e5 here, d3, bishop c5, bishop d2, knight d4. Knight f3, queen e7, c3. Not going to go into depth on some of these moves just to get to the critical moment. We get to this position here, right around here, with queen f6, queen d1, trade, queen g6, where Magnus has a small pull here. He has this great knight on g4, pawn on h3, and after rook f4, f5, now the center is guarded, knight is guarded, weaknesses here on the king side, and it feels like this knight should be better than this bishop, getting back to the theme of knights versus bishops in bullet chess. So after f5, I go rook f1, he castles, c4, king h7, bishop b4, trying to activate the bishop, maybe create a pass pawn in the center of the board. We get rook f7, and now I sack the queen for the knight on g4. Now this is one of the things that's really, really important to note, is that Magnus and I have obviously played many, many games over the years. And one thing that Magnus is very good at, in particular playing against me, but also against players like Wesley, so is understanding our tendencies and the patterns of how we approach certain positions. Now, I will straight up say that whether this is bullet or blitz or whatever it might be in the old days, I would never consider sacrificing the queen for the knight here, because I think, well, why are you sacking the queen for the knight? It's balanced material, just defend, you'll be fine, just keep the game going, good things can happen. But that is one thing that's changed, because I do not feel any risk anymore when I'm playing chess, and I simply go with the flow. I felt like, why not sack the queen? Why not try to be the hero of the day and win this game with the queen sack? So so I decided to sack the queen here. And again, it's not that the sack is great or anything. It's actually not all that great, but it's the fact that I feel like there's no risk and I can try to do these things. Whereas in the old days, I would never do this. And this, I think, is also one of the reasons Magnus has struggled against me in recent years, is a lot of the decisions I make in critical moments are completely different than the decisions that I would have made in the pre-pandemic world. So I sacked the queen. Now, this of course does not end up working out all that great for me. because basically we get to this end game where Magnus is able to trade off, and eventually I end up losing this game because after this great g5 move, the rook can no longer guard the central pawn, and when I take on g4, Magnus plays queen f7 here, threatening to create the classic lolly checkmate on g2. Rook can't go here because the pawn takes the rook, and after rook g5, queen f3, I can give up the rook and the game goes on. But again, queen versus bishop, I will lose this every time, so I lose this game to Magnus. So what does this mean? This means that we go into overtime, and I believe the score going into overtime was 13.5 to 13.5, and now we have 6 games, matches all square. Effectively, after the 6 games that we're tied, it'll be sudden death. Whoever wins first wins, or if someone wins 2 games in a row in the final 6, they win. So the first game was a draw. I believe that in the second game I lost after first game was a draw of the sudden death or the overtime. I won the next game to take a 1-point lead. Magnus struck back to win, and I believe we were tied as we go into this fateful third or fourth game. I forget which number it was, but I think it was the 4th game of the match. So here I have the white pieces. I play e4, Magnus plays c6, knight c3, d5. I play knight f3, standard Carlsen setup. Again, the reason I play knight f3 is very simple, because I'm going to get quick development. When you play things like d4 after takes knight f6, already you have tough decisions to make, whether to trade the knight, whether to go knight g3, knight g5, etc. Additionally, black can even play knight d7 and knight f6, and when you go knight f3, it's very simple. You either play d3, d4, you take your moves are reactive to what black does. So Magnus plays a6, I go d4, bishop g4, I play bishop d3, we get e6, I play h3, he goes bishop h5, I play queen e2. Not a good move, by the way, but it's still not the worst either. He goes knight f6, and now I play e5, which is already sort of a step in the wrong direction. Probably here I should have played something like bishop g5 and castles, or maybe just traded on d5 even and taken the slightly worse pawn structure. Instead, I play e5, knight d7, go g4, bishop g6, we trade, knight d1, c5, c3 to build the pawn chain from b2 to e5. Oops, oh, I hit the wrong thing. Spoiler alert. I guess I hit the down button, not the forward button. Wrong button on my keyboard. Sorry, you guys. Knight c6, I go bishop e3, rook c8, I play king f1. I'd love to castle here, but after rook takes h3, now I'm down a pawn. So I try to manually castle the king to g2. We get queen b6, king g2, bishop e7. Now I play a3, trying to play b4 and open up the center. We get queen b5, queen d2, and I'm just slowly getting squeezed in this position. Magnus has a nice advantage here. Easy play. You can take on d4, play f6. All my moves are sort of reactionary to Magnus's plan, fortunately, but nonetheless, it's a hard position to play because I don't have any actual super obvious plans. So game continues with queen d1, takes king d7. We eventually end up in an endgame here. Now this is an endgame which is actually quite different than the other endgames because there is an imbalance. Black has a great knight on c4. I have a pawn on c3, which is kind of weak. Black can go f6 here down the road and try to play in the center, and my plans are not obvious. So this is an endgame which I think makes a lot of sense to go into. So Magnus plays rook c7, I go bishop g5, b6, we trade, knight e3, knight a5, rook c1, rook c8, knight d1 back to guard the pawn on c3. He plays f6, takes knight e1, goes e5, knight d3, and now he plays this great move, knight d2. Or actually, sorry, this move isn't great. Knight d2 is actually a blunder, but here I play this horrible move, rook b2. Now knight d2 is a blunder because after rook takes b6 and e takes d4, I can simply play moves like knight b4 or knight f4 potentially to go after these pawns in the center of the board or on the edges, and I would have had great chance to win. Instead, I go rook b2, missing knight b3. I play d takes e5 here, and now Magnus takes the rook on c1. Now at this point, time is very tricky because we're at about 30 seconds. We're nearing the end of the overtime session. It's really a situation where you have to make the right decisions in those split seconds as opposed to gambling. So I take, he takes the rook, I take on f6, he takes, and now I practically speaking play the best move, knight takes c1. I'd love to play rook b6 check, but after rook c6 takes knight c1 here, black can play something like knight e4, maybe rook c4 as well. And with the rook and knight versus the two knights, it's easier to play this position with the rook versus the knight. Always easier to play this with the limited material on the board. So even though knight takes c1 is not the best move, it's the best practical decision because the best chance I have of winning is using these knights as well as the rook. I cannot win with only the knights on the board. So we get knight c4, I go rook c2, Magnus plays d4. Again, an excellent move here, gambiting a pawn. So I take, Magnus simply play knight e3 check and trade down into an endgame once again, and the rook will easily beat the knight. Easily, not even close. So I go king g3, he plays knight a5, play knight d3, and here Magnus takes on c3. Now this isn't a terrible move, but it starts this situation where here I get to unwind the knights and it gets kind of tricky. He goes rook d7 here, doesn't want to allow this knight d5 fork. I take, he goes king g7, now I play f3, and here Magnus essentially throws the game away with this move, rook c7. Now this move is still a good move, black is still winning, but the reason that rook c7 is such a bad move is that rook c7 now allows me to untangle the knights, where I can move the rook and I can keep my rook on the board. If Magnus had played knight b3 here, I think there's a very, very good chance that he wins this game, because the only move that I can really play here to keep the game going is knight e4, allowing the trade of the rooks, and then after knight to c5, we're in a situation where it will be a rook versus knight, and Magnus should win this game. But he goes rook c7, I play knight d5, rook c5, and now I'm able to play rook b2, and now I've untangled it to where even though Magnus has a chance to sack the rook for the 2 knights here by sacking on c3, after rook b6, the show goes on, and I'll have a rook on the board, and it will be very, very much a time scramble. So he goes knight c4, rook b4, a5, rook b1, knight e5, I take on b6, he sacks the rook for the 2 knights, and here we're actually very even on time. But the problem for Magnus in this position is that my moves are a little bit easier to play, because he's up the knight, but he has to react and he has to play the right move. For example, here if he goes knight f7 after h4, h5, it's still probably very good for black, but it's very hard to prove the advantage because white has all these little tricks here, so you can't get the pre-moves in, and it's going to be difficult to win. So he takes the pawn, which is the correct move. I go g5 here, knight h4, I play rook b7 check, king f8, and now I go rook h7. Magnus plays knight f5, and now I play king e5. And the problem with this position for Magnus is essentially, even though he has an extra knight, he has to prove the advantage. He has no obvious pre-moves. He has to be worried about rook a7, king e5, king f6 check. So many possibilities, and one thing that you'd love to do is pre-move king e7. When I go king e5, like, you might pre-move king e7 here, but if I'm not checking, then you don't get the pre-moves. So you're always hovering and or making the pre-moves, and it's very, very difficult to play because white is the one who has the easier moves. So I play king e5, we got knight e7, king f6, he checks. Rook c6 would have been the winning move here in this position, but he checks. I go king e6, check, king f6, and now he plays king e8, I check, and I go rook a8. And again, all my moves are super easy to play. His moves are very difficult because he doesn't really want to hang this pawn. He has to worry about rook a7, rook a6, and I almost can pre-move here like h4, rook a7 in fact. So he plays rook f3, king g7, rook f5, I check, king e6, I check, king e5, and now I play h4 here, guarding the pawn. Of course, at this point, I'm just trying to move really fast because Magnus still is moving really quickly, and the times are very close. I'm only up 0.8. So he goes knight d5, I take on a5, rook f4, I take, king g7, rook d4, g6, and he goes rook c4 here. And after rook a6, check, king h6. Now I'm able to win the game because I'm up 2 seconds, but also I have easy pre-moves. G7, very easy pre-move, rook e6, rook g6. All these pre-moves flow, and Magnus doesn't have an obvious move. The game continues with knight f4, g7, and after rook c8, rook a5, the last check here, Magnus flags. I win this game, and I take a 16-15 lead going into what will turn out to be the last game of the match. So here we are in game number, I believe game number 5 of the overtime, and again, I'm up by 1, so if I win this game, it's all over. Magnus again plays e4, g6. We get the same modern setup here, and as always, I'm able to get this d6 e5 setup. First 10-15 moves, very easy to play. I play rook e8, trying to play on the e file, knight d2, b6, trying to fianchetto. All these moves I'm able to play really, really quickly here, and because of that, I get out of the opening. And once I get out of the opening, I filled it in the middle game here. The problem with these positions is that I've played 15 moves very quickly. I'm able to react to whatever he does. And white, again, Magnus has to prove the point. He has to prove the advantage here. And a bullet, you don't really have time to come with the deep positional plans to prove advantage. It's generally going to be tactics or attacks, things of that nature. And Magnus just is not able to do it. So after b4, I play a5, a3, we trade, I go c5 here. Again, very difficult spot here for Magnus because he has to decide. Does he want to play en passant here, try to play against these weak pawns potentially on b6 and d6? Does he just want to play something like in the game where he goes like rook b1, bc5, tries to play on b5? What does he want to do? Either way, I react, and my moves again are going to be very easy. Say, for example, white plays en passant and plays something like rook d1. I'm obviously going to go queen c7. If white goes to f1, you hang the pawn on e4. If white goes like bishop b1, for example, I can even just go bishop f8, guarding the pawn, and then I can play rook a1 or rook a4, and maybe even stacking the rooks on the a file. But either way, my moves are very easy to play, and Magnus has to prove the advantage. So after c5, he trades on c5, plays queen c2, queen c7, king h2. I swap all the rooks down. Again, I'm not very unhappy if the game ends in a draw here. Pretty much it's very normal. We reach this balanced position here. I play queen d7, bishop f8, try to rotate the bishop around to d8 here, queen a1, knight b6, bishop c2, queen c8 here. Idea to play either bishop a6 and go after the pawn on c4 or queen a8. And now Magnus commits with f4. Now again, I don't really blame him for playing this move, but at this point in the situation where Magnus needs to win, it's probably worth it to use like 3 or 4 seconds to try to come up with a plan. as opposed to just blitzing. But again, very easy to say in retrospect, seeing what the result was. So he plays f4, I take, he takes, I take, and now I go knight d7 here. I'm very happy to trade off the bishops. King a little bit loose here, but if I can get this knight to e5, I'll have a great outpost, and the knight on e5 will always spy the pawn on c4. So Magnus goes knight f3, queen e7, and now I play this move knight to e5. Happily, I'll trade the knights because after trade, king f2, probably queen b2 is close to winning for black. I don't know if it's obviously winning, but it's very good. So here Magnus plays king f2, and now I play this move knight takes c4 after a bit of a think. Now this is a move that I played to basically go all in. I did see that Magnus had this idea with bishop d3 and bishop a6, but I correctly assessed that after bishop d3 I would have enough counterplay with knight b2, because after bishop a6, which pins the bishop on b7 here, it looks really scary on first glance. I can't take the bishop because I lose my queen on e7. If I take on e4 after queen b7, suddenly f7 is weak, the knight is weak, and it feels really scary. But I guess correctly is wrong. I intuitively sensed that there had to be something, and I'm able to find the right move, which is knight to d1. Magnus plays king g1 here, which I think is a mistake. I think he probably should have gone king g3, allowing some like knight to c3, queen takes b7, and queen f6 here, hitting the pawn on c4. Even knight takes e4 maybe is okay. At any rate, I think king g3 would have been better, because after king g1 I take on e4, Magnus takes on b7, and now I check on e3, king h2, I check, and now he plays king h1, which is a mistake. He could have gone king g1, queen e3, and the game would have ended in a draw. But obviously at this point, we're nearing the end of the overtime. I don't think either of us knew exactly how many games were left, what the situation was. And Magnus decides to go king h1 instead, which now allows knight to f2 check, king g1, and the crushing move knight takes h3, because now when Magnus takes knight, I do not have to recapture his knight, but I can check first, and after king f1 takes king e1, I check, he goes bishop e2, I check, and now I decide to play this move c4. Now again, very difficult situation here, because I can obviously just play something like king g7, queen e5, queen f6, and sit on the position. In a situation where white has a bishop and all these pawns are on dark squares, probably very hard for Magnus to mount a challenge. c4 on the other hand, very committal here, because Magnus can obviously sack the bishop, and after takes, this will end in a draw. Or he could choose to try and play on, which is what he does with queen b6, but this loses the game, because now after c3 the pawn is rushing down the board in a hurry here, bishop very passive, and it's hard to play. Here Magnus plays queen c6. He could have tried queen c7, but after queen d2, king f2, and king g7, it's the same problem here, where after queen to d6 I can now go check, and I believe after king f3 I can play c2, because when he goes queen c7 I have queen to b2, I cover the checks on c3 and e5, and I will simply make a queen on the next turn and win the game. So queen c7 would have put up more resistance, but after queen c6 it ends instantly with check, king f2, c2, queen c7, queen to f4, checking the king and guarding the pawn, and Magnus resigns, because once he moves the king I make a queen. Queen guards the queen, but queen also guards the pawn on f7, and I simply have an extra queen on the board with 10 extra seconds on the clock. So I end up winning the second game in a row in what turns out to be the final game between Magnus and myself in the Bullet Chess Championship. With that, I win the match by a final score of 17-15. Very choppy match, very up and down. I know I went over a lot of games. Some games I took longer than others. Obviously, going over so many, I can't explain all the ideas, but I think the biggest takeaways I would say, there were a couple takeaways. First takeaway is that Magnus too oftentimes ended up in end games where it was bishop versus knight, which in bullet chess, knight is always going to be better than the bishop. Maybe not always, but I would say the vast majority of the time. Second thing is the openings. When I played this modern, I too easily was able to get 10-15 moves and get out of the opening without any issues, and that really helped me later on, because then my anticipation, I think in general I was a little bit quicker than Magnus, and when I was able to blitz out the openings, not have to think, that really gave me a big advantage. So those are probably the two big mistakes Magnus made. That being said, he's obviously a great fighter. He found a way to keep it close, found a way almost to even win the match, considering how far behind he was early on. I think for me, probably some of those moments of the bishop endgame specifically would have been better if I had not gone for it, but nonetheless everything did work out. I did win the match. I did become the Bullet Chess champion for the 4th time in 5 years. It's great to win. Obviously, I know one of these days I'm not going to win. I know Magnus or Ali Reza will probably beat me, but nonetheless, we do take the dubs for right now. So I win the Bullet Chess Championship. I do win the first prize of $20,000, and it's all great for right now. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap. I know the video is a bit long, but I tried to cover as much as I could in so much as you can in bullet chess. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. Make sure to hit that subscribe button below if you haven't already. Make sure to leave your comments, and I'll be back very soon with some more great YouTube only content. See you guys. Bye.